So welcome everybody. This is our 48th, our 48th monthly webinar. I can't believe I've been doing this for a little over 4 years. But this is a topic that has become sort of apparent in the last, a few months in my conversations with people. And part of it is related, and I should mention that the slide set here is shorter than usual. I think we'll have a little bit more time than usual to talk at the end. So please note down your questions or ideas or contributions. I'd like to wait to the end to do that so we can get through the so-called content and then we can have a conversation. But please, write some notes down so we can have a conversation. But what I was going to say is that this is a topic that's come up um, on and off for a long time as kind of a thing in my way of thinking about this work. And part of it is related to our coaching program, which I'm not going to talk about today really. But one of the things that my colleague who I can see is here, Ian Patterson, and I have been talking about recently is, first of all, why coaching in the business world is so often behavior based, or maybe even more general than that, almost looking like non-directive therapy, where it's basically asking a lot of questions. But in the process, what I've started to look at is why do coaching programs and coaching processes not focus on accomplishments in the way that ours do? And what I think is, and this is a topic for next month actually, what I think is it's because typically even those people who are accomplishment based performance improvement people identify accomplishments that are so big, such a big chunk size, that it's very hard to delineate specifically what behaviors need to produce them. And we don't do it that way, as you'll see. But I think in the absence of sort of manageable size work outputs or accomplishments, I think people are often looking at business results. They're trying to coach people in behavior that will contribute to business results. So this has brought up some interesting conversations from my perspective, and that's why we wanted to pursue this. And before I mention it, though, next month, or before we get into it, next month we're going to talk about finding the right size, or the Goldilocks size of accomplishments. And where the Goldilocks things come from is our colleague Scott Mills, who is a really thoughtful and accomplished performance improvement colleague. And Scott, we were speaking recently about some work that he did, and what we recognized was that even if you trace the work of accomplishment-based performance improvement back to Tom Gilbert, who is really the person that inspired me and probably hundreds, if not thousands, of other people in the field of performance improvement, often people talk about these giant accomplishments. They say, well, Joe Harless even used to say this, I believe, a given job should be able to produce maybe 5 to 7 major accomplishments. Well, I think that's awfully big. And what we notice is that when we are working either in our coaching program or our performance consulting program where analysis is involved, we need to chunk those down. And so there's going to be a whole conversation about that and some of the implications of it. And you can always go to our website at performancethinking.com and find the little icon on the right and register. But you can also point your phone at this QR code on the left and register for that if you're not already registered. But getting back to the topic for today, this is a slide that has been in our programs and our presentations for at least 2 decades now. And what we always say is that as performance consultants, and specifically in our approach called performance thinking, that our purpose is to accelerate business results through the performance of people. That's what our jam is, as they say. It's about how we enable people to contribute to and accelerate the results of the organization. And if you talk to people about this, not just in this area of performance consulting, but in a lot of other areas too, people have this phrase, business acumen. And I've been hearing that phrase for decades. I see colleagues like Marty, for example, I think with this Marty Wyckoff, who has done work like we have in sales enablement. And, it was traditionally discussed decades ago how good salespeople that are business to business salespeople have to have business acumen. And, what does that really mean? I don't know. I'm not sure what it all together means, although we have an answer later. But this is just something I pulled off on the internet. I believe I Googled performance consulting and business acumen. What does that mean? And so the statement says a performance consultant needs strong business acumen to effectively diagnose and address performance issues within an organization, as it allows them to understand how individual and team performance directly impacts the company's overall goals, financial health, and strategic direction, enabling them to tailor solutions that align with the broader business needs. Unquote. Now, I remember back in the 80s when I believe the first book that I ever recall that was titled Business Acumen, or excuse me, Performance Consulting, um, to me was training on steroids because it really didn't talk about very much beyond skills and knowledge as an intervention. But it always seemed to me that what they were saying is we need training professionals or performance professionals who can talk in a fairly sophisticated way with their business clients about business. Now, that sounds good, but and it's great to have an MBA. I mean, this is a bunch of MBAs graduating at my graduate school alma mater, Harvard, and so Harvard MBA or whatever. It's great to have an MBA, no question about it. And the half dozen people that I know in the performance improvement world, or probably less, that who have degrees in various fields, including business, that's a good thing. No problem about it. But I think that's more than is needed in many ways. And because what I would say is, at least as performance thinking performance consultants or professionals, that our specialized expertise is the analysis and continuous improvement of human performance based on behavior science. So that little graphic underneath that probably most of you recognize if you've been through our programs or looked at our YouTube channel is what we call, it's really our two models. It's the performance chain across the top and then the 6 boxes model. And the logic that we teach people starts with the end in mind, as we'll talk about shortly. But that's what I would argue is really our expertise. And of course, we want to be able to understand our clients' businesses or their organizations. Maybe they're not for profit, so maybe they wouldn't call themselves businesses, but organizations of whatever kind. That's true. And this is what I kind of want to get into a little bit about how we talk about it, how we think about it, at least in the performance thinking world. Now, this is a reminder that I don't think anybody in this list of people needs to have because you mostly are familiar with our work. But this we trace our history back to Tom Gilbert, who was not only often called the father of human performance technology, although fans of Gary Rumler would argue with that and claim that Gary was one of them or the co-father or something too. But this important book, Human Competence, that probably many of you have read and is still taught in some graduate programs in behavior analysis and other fields, made a big statement. And there were a lot of stuff in the book. It's a brilliant kind of book of philosophy, really. But he said, as you all know, I think, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. But we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. So that was a famous statement. That's one of those ones that ought to get chiseled into granite somewhere. And of course, that's where we start out. Now, how does that relate to the topic at hand about what's at stake here? Well, what we call, by the way, as many of you know, we use the phrase work outputs because there's some arguments about what an accomplishment is, how big it is, how you define it, should there be verbs in the descriptions and so forth. And I never wanted to get into that argument. So we kind of coined the phrase work outputs maybe 30 years ago to talk about accomplishments. It's a synonym for accomplishments in our vocabulary. So, okay, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it talks about valuable accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. And so I want to talk about where that word valuable comes up. But before I get into it, I started thinking about Okay, if I meet a new client, especially in the old days before COVID, where we actually met in people's offices a lot. But even now, if it's on Zoom or on some sort of web-based thing, we might do the same thing. We would just do it on a screen. But it used to be very often I would sit down in some vice president's office or head of training development or whatever the role was, and particularly if it was a business person, an operate, person with line management responsibilities, a VP of customer service or of sales or a operations person or somebody in charge of their manufacturing. Um, I'd ask them a bunch of questions to start. I'd say, I'd really like to know about your business and like, what's the context? What's the market like that you guys sell into or that you're working in, you're competing in? Tell me about your products and what's at stake here, because you've called me in to help you with some kind of performance. So why? What's at stake? And that's really the title of this webinar, because in the very beginning, we want to understand from the business person what is at stake. Or even if it's not a business person, the person inside the company, they may be in a staff role, but nonetheless, why are we doing this? What do you hope to gain? And what are the organizational level results you'd like to improve or achieve? So that's just kind of a summary of the kind of conversation that I would typically have with a new client, because I'm really trying to understand the world they're in. And those of you who have done this work may recognize it or may agree with me that I think this is often the most interesting part of our work, especially when I'm going into a new industry. And I've worked across probably, I don't know, 12 or 15 industries in my almost 50 years of performance consulting. And, it's always really interesting to learn about, it's a new industry, biotech or whatever it is. So we have that conversation with them. And of course, we're talking about business there at some level. So that's where so-called business acumen might be relevant. And then we probably drill down, because they probably didn't call us in and just say, in a big company, especially, and I've mostly worked with sort of global 1,000 size companies. They usually don't come in and say, well, we have a revenue problem. What should we do? They usually are calling, at least in my case, and my companies, my 4 consulting firms that I've had over the years, they're usually calling us in because they want to improve customer service. They want to ramp up their people faster. They want to optimize sales performance. They've got a new product launch, perhaps, and they want sales and marketing to be able to get up to speed more quickly. They have a change management thing. They're implementing a new system. They've got a process that's all messed up. And so it's not like they say, oh, we have a business result, fix it. They'll usually point us to some function. And in fact, usually the people we're speaking with at this point are decision makers in that function. So then the next step is, after you've learned something about the business, you say, well, okay, so let me tell you about your department or your function and the performance and the people that you want to develop or improve or change. And how about that contribute to the organization's success if you do that? And again, we're really talking about business results there, the second part of it, because what we're trying to say is, for example, I remember a project at Dun and Bradstreet decades ago where we're working on sales proposals, because the proposals were kind of hit and miss. They weren't doing so well. It was one particular part of the sales organization there. And, if the concern is market share versus, let's say, revenue or profit, in particular profit, that might make a difference in how this conversation goes. Because if they don't care about profits right now, but they're trying to just expand their customer base, their market share, then they might be willing to have proposals that are not profitably priced. And so the accomplishment, the thing that we're working on, if it's a proposal improving sales proposals, might actually have different focus than if it were about profitability. Whereas if it's about profitability, we want to optimize that. So you're already weaving into your conversation some discussion about business results. And then, of course, we get down to it, where after we've had some sort of conversation roughly in those first 2 areas, we say, okay, well, who can I talk to? Who can I interview and observe and figure out what's really going on? Because I want to speak to the performers. And of course, I want to talk to the managers and such too, but I really want to talk to people doing the work and maybe observe them so I can understand what's going on. And then what I've done for a long time, and to me, this is part of the communication and partnering from the very first step with business clients, is again, if I were in the room with people, if I were on a screen, I might just put up a PowerPoint. But if I'm in the room, I might say, "Hey, can I use your whiteboard? Because I think I can tell you a little bit about how we think about performance and the factors that influence it. And I'll move to this." And what I typically do is real simple to draw, and to talk about. Typically, I'd start out with business results, and I'd say, "Well, what's at stake here? From what you've been telling me, there's some issues around customer satisfaction and whatever, and we talk about that and say, so that's clearly, I heard that, and that's important." Well, the way we think about it is when we start looking at your people and the performance of your people, whether it's individuals, like in a call center, for example, or whether it's teams, like swarming, teams that are coming together in a small manufacturing environment, or maybe it's a process. There's people involved, and we want to see what are their accomplishments or their work outputs, because that's what's contributing to business results. That's you know we can change that and improve your results. And then once we know that, what we try to figure out by observing and doing task analysis and interviewing some of your successful performers, we try to understand what behavior, what stuff they have to do to produce those work outputs. And then once we do that, we use our little model called the 6 boxes model, and you can see all the things in those cells. But simple as it is, this little model summarizes pretty much everything that can be done or that is relevant to improving the behavior to produce the work outputs to contribute to business results. So I sort of go through maybe like a little 5-minute shtick like that. And I've never had a business person say, "Well, that looks pretty weird." They usually say, "Oh, makes sense to me." And in fact, maybe halfway through, they're starting to get involved in the conversation. So I just want to emphasize here that I believe this is one of the differentiators of our performance thinking approach, which is that this model is not only a framework for me and you and other performance professionals to think about the elements of performance and how they fit together and how to optimize them, but it's a really good plain English communication framework. It is, the language was user tested back in the 80s. I kind of refined it for some period of time until we came up with words that we knew communicated, that people didn't misunderstand. And so you can have this conversation with business people and already begin to kind of have a little bit of a mind meld. And so then we can expand on that, of course. And this is anybody who's been through our programs or seen our other sessions has probably seen this before. But, the notion is, let's talk a little bit more about this, and let's talk about some details. And notice that we always talk about this is how behavior produces business results, because it's behavior that produces those work outputs or those accomplishments. And it works from left to right. You got a bunch of stuff that's in the environment and in the person, and in other words, what we call behavior influences, the 6 boxes stuff. And that hopefully supports, or maybe in some cases gets in the way of behavior. But ideally, what we want is for it to optimally support the behavior to produce those work outputs that are valuable because they contribute to business results. And we analyze it with the end in mind. We start out trying to be sure we understand what's at stake. So that's kind of the way we think about it. Now, those two things, work outputs and business results, are, of course, tightly connected. And there's a couple of things about this. One is, if the work outputs don't credibly contribute to business results, then we might consider getting rid of them. Some of you here who've done probably process work, especially if you've worked with lean process people, know that people are looking for waste. And especially when you do things like introduce new systems for administrative processes and such, sometimes there's things like forms that we've been filling out for years, and we realize, wait a minute, these don't add any value at all. They don't contribute to business results. They just take time. So we're going to get rid of those. So that's one thing in the relationship between work outputs and results. But the second thing is what's highlighted in orange there, what we call criteria for a good one. And what we mean by that is we want to define an example of the deliverable or the decision or the relationship or whatever the output is, the countable noun, the product behavior, we want to say what is a good one, by which we mean what does it have to be considered good and very importantly to contribute to business results. So, for example, going back to the sales example, if we're trying to improve our profit margins and we're working on proposals, we want to be sure those proposals are profitably priced. Or if we're involved in a documentation development process, we want to be sure that the edits that the editor puts in are easy to understand and apply by the person who's updating the document if it's another person. So we want to look at the business results and the recipient of those outputs to define what a good one is. And that's pretty important especially in how it relates to business results. Now, one of the problems is what I've noticed in not just coaching, but an enormous amount of training and performance improvement work is that people do not explicitly define the accomplishments or the work outputs, or else they're so big that they're hard to figure out what the behavior is. So very often people are trying to bridge from behavior that they're trying to get people to do. Ask a lot more open-ended questions or use the customer's first name or whatever it is, the behavior, and they're trying to persuade folks that if you behave in that way, it'll contribute to business results. Now, I don't think that's very compelling, frankly. And so what we've added, of course, is explicit definition of work outputs at a level of chunk size, if you will, that really does connect behavior to business results. So a widget that meets criteria contributes to productivity, potentially to revenue if it's something that's going to get sold, if it's done on time, possibly to customer satisfaction. So we can begin to look at the work outputs and the criteria for those work outputs and show people how their day-to-day behavior makes a contribution. So that's a big deal. It's a big deal from a management and coaching perspective, and it's a context in which we use descriptions of organization business results to help the people in the company understand how they're contributing to the whole rather than just taking home a paycheck, which of course is important to them. But most people like to feel like they're making a contribution. Now, this looks like an extra slide actually, but these are the three elements that we really are looking at. We want to be sure these things all line up, and that ultimately, as I've already said probably 3 times, that the behavior is the optimal behavior, the best practices behavior for producing the work outputs that meet the criteria and therefore contribute to the organization's results. Now, so if you step back, our company name is Performance Thinking, as you all know, and one of our registered trademarks is Performance Thinking, and that's because about probably in 2010, something like that, when we were working in a number of companies early on, when we were teaching people our approach, we had folks like at Anthem, for example, was one company where they said, you're giving us some tools and a methodology and all that, but actually you're giving us a way to think about performance. And one of the things that I've recognized is those 2 simple models that I've showed you and that we are always using is simple enough that you can sort of grok it all at once and you can start to understand how these things all connect. So when we're thinking about performance, but also when we're talking to people, what I mentioned a few minutes ago is like we ask, what's at stake for your organization? That's where we're trying to be sure we understand the business results that the people are concerned about. And then, of course, as I've already said, we also want to take a look and be sure that work outputs credibly contribute to business results. Now, part of the sort of craft of this work is that we're not expecting people to do some sort of controlled experiment to demonstrate that if I, increase some work output, that it's going to produce increased business results. One of the reasons for that is because we have time to do, careful experiments in most cases. But more importantly, very often it takes a whole bunch of different work outputs or accomplishments to move the dial on business results. And very often, any given work output might contribute potentially to a number of them of business results. Now, I've been using the word incredibly in there for a long time because what I've noticed is that if you identify the outputs in a process or for a role or for a team that's producing, usually people can fairly readily say, well, if this is a good one, it'll make a difference for our customer satisfaction or safety or whatever it is. Or they'll say, oh, if this is not up to speed, it could undermine one or more business results. So that's a context in which we think and talk about this. And then I've already mentioned this notion of criteria. So often the criteria for a good output is related to business results. Now, it might be related to customer satisfaction because, as in process work, we talk about voice of the customer. We want to be sure that the final product really meets requirements or needs or wants of the customer. But sometimes it's just, for example, on a production line of some kind, or when you're submitting proposals to clients or various other contexts, one of the criteria for a good one might be by a certain time, completed by a certain time, ready to go, whatever. That can make a difference in customer satisfaction, productivity, operational efficiency. So we want to define criteria that as much as possible will help the performer, help us, help define feedback, et cetera, to be sure that the output will meet or contribute to business results. And then I already mentioned with that one slide, talking about organizational level business results is also, frankly, part of employee engagement if it's done well. Now, I want to make a point here about levels of business results, and I'll show you some examples shortly. But one of the things that comes up a lot in our programs is, as you know, there's lots of levels of results or key performance indicators being measures of results sometimes that are sort of down inside the company. So a classic one is you got a big company that has a whole lot of different stuff going on, and part of it is some processes, administered processes or manufacturing processes. So people might be concerned about cycle time. How quickly does it take to get the widget or whatever it is, the application processed? How quickly do we turn stuff around in the process, in other words? Now, those are important measures. Those are important results. But what I'm always asking is, why do we care about that? Because when we're having this conversation that I've been sort of laying out for you, what I'm interested in is for the whole organization. What I want to know is if I were an investor or a senior executive or someone else, a company evaluator, and I were looking at that organization, be it a company in the commercial sense or a not-profit, I would say, what are the results this organization has to achieve to sustain and grow and be successful? So I'm always pushing people to the level of what I would call organization level business results. And if we do that, and then we have conversations with employees, it can be an important wake-up call. For example, I see a few people here who are from the behavior analysis, autism, special needs, education, clinical kind of world, the behavioral health world, really. And one of the things I know that happens in that environment is very often the frontline service delivery people, the behavior technicians or whatever they're called in the organization, have to produce at the end of a session with a client a session note, a little description of what happened, and et cetera. Now, those can be useless. They can be written in such a way that they don't really communicate much of value. And at the other end, if you're getting insurance reimbursement and you have an audit by the insurance company, those session notes need to meet certain criteria. And so you can have a conversation with one of those RBTs and say, I know you're just doing these notes a bunch of times a day, but be aware that if they're not up to speed, if don't meet the criteria and have the content in them that we've defined, we could be in trouble. We could lose revenue because the insurance company might say, oh, this is not up to par, and they would call us on it. So you can very often or like a little form that gets filled out on a screen, say, oh man, I do 100 of those a day. Well, you can say, look, If you fill out this thing after the last call with a customer, and that customer calls back again, and someone else is the call is routed to this other customer, you need to put enough information in this note so that they can pick up where you left off and continue and optimize customer satisfaction. So employees recognition of what I remember at Hewlett Packard, they used to talk about a line of sight from the performance of the individual and the team up to the organization's business results is a big deal, and that's another context in which we talk about it. And the performance chain as a kind of a mental model helps in that way. And then, of course, if you are thinking about measuring and deciding if things are working or not, the challenge with most business results is that they are lagging indicators. And by that we mean, at least by that I mean, that we don't get enough data points fast enough to make decisions. So a lot of results, whether they're customer satisfaction surveys or employee satisfaction surveys or revenue or profit or market share or safety, any of those things, very often you're lucky to get those data once a month, maybe once a quarter in some cases. And you can't make solid decisions with one or two data points because it doesn't take into account the variability or possible trends. You need more data than that, more data points on your graph, literally, in order to figure out, if this thing is improving or not. So measure the business results when you can. Most companies do, but they're really lagging indicators. The cool thing is that if you can identify critical work outputs that obviously contribute to business results and that are relatively easy to capture, you might be able to capture counts or measures of those work outputs on an hourly, daily, or weekly basis. And that means that can be a leading indicator. You can make decisions within a week or two, maybe, about whether this is working or not and make changes. So in terms of our ability to partner with business people as performance professionals, those leading indicators are important, and work outputs are a big deal. But notice the work outputs ought to be things that everyone agrees sort of credibly contribute to organizational results. And then, of course, when you get to the end of a project, or when you get to a point where you're telling people how it's going, a status report, a progress report, you want to report the business results, but if possible, work outputs. Possible, what did you improve and how does that relate to the business? And so here's an example. This is actually something I published over 20 years ago with Lee Sweeney, who was he was the manager of a premier customer call center for AT&T Wireless down in the Los Angeles area. And he was also had been an athletic coach, so he really got it about performance. But these are two graphs of results. On the left, they're basically outputs. They are practices. They're practice activities during training and during coaching of people being able to respond to practice cards that had questions and prompts on them. So the output there is accurate, correct answers to questions, eventually to be used with customers. And so that's that's on a daily basis. You can see improvement over 2 weeks' time. Those are 5 or 6 individuals whose timings, how many per minute they can get correct on any given day. So that's about each of those 3 columns on the left are about 5 or 6 people over about 2 weeks. You can see the trend. It's multiplying times 3. So that's pretty impressive. That's a nice learning rate. Now, if you go over on the right, you've got a productivity measure, which is in call centers. They tend to measure first call resolutions or solutions delivered to customers. And what we had here was, this is on a daily basis, and so this is over a few weeks also. What we saw was the people who were trained in the methodology that they'd used before we showed up, actually in their first few weeks on the job, decelerated a little bit. But the people in the black dots who were trained with our methodology, which incorporated fluency practice and an environment which really supported performance in the other boxes, the 6 boxes, you saw them accelerating. And in fact, it's not marked on here, but they hit the benchmark of calls per hour and then beat it by 60%. So that's like, oh, you can't argue with that. And if you want to get that article, by the way, you can use that QR code. So the question is, coming back to my original comment about business acumen. Like, what do we need? What is business acumen for the performance professional? And here I have a slightly snarky answer, but I'm. It's been a political season recently, and so I was reminded of James Carville, who used to say during the Clinton presidential election, he said, "Is the economy stupid?" Well, it's the vocabulary. I think that's fake. I don't think we have to be sophisticated MBAs. I think as performance professionals, we need the right language. And so here's an example in both our coaching program and our performance consulting program. We suggest that performance consultants create what we call a pick list of business results. Now, what I mean by that is if you look at the documentation in your company or your organization, things like strategic plans, reports from the CEO or executive director, updates of various things. If you look in some of the other kinds of documentation, if you're in meetings, if you look at what people are measuring, if you do a little bit of investigation, you're going to come up with a list of things, specific words and phrases that we use around here, wherever here is, to describe business results. Now, I've been asking my people, especially in our performance consulting program, for probably 15 years to do that, because the idea is if you've got a list of the vocabulary we use around here, then when you're speaking to senior executives or to your colleagues or to the people whose performance you're trying to improve, you can use the words that we use around here to talk about organizational level business results. And so that list that you have right there is not a pick list. It's probably too big for most companies, too many things. But we give that to the people in our programs as a starter, and we say, here's the kind of things we're talking about. So some of these might actually be the vocabulary you all use in your organization. But why don't you speak with your leaders and look at your documents and come up with your list so you know the vocabulary of how people talk about it? One of the things we've learned over the years is that a lot of organizations, there's not a consistent way people talk about business results. You might have people in the executive suite using a certain vocabulary, but people in, let's say, process improvement are using another vocabulary, et cetera. So we want to get the words right. Do we talk about employee satisfaction around here? Do we talk about employee engagement? Do we talk about both things? Are they separate? Are they different? So what you're trying to do is literally get a vocabulary that people can agree on and all know what they're talking about. In my opinion, that lays a foundation for learning more about the business, but also for having the kind of conversations that I mentioned earlier. And I don't think it requires an MBA. I think it requires obviously some engagement, some learning about the business, but it's largely a vocabulary issue and understanding then if these things are measured, how they're measured. So this can apply in a lot of ways. Here's an example of a tool that we use that many of you are familiar with, I think, called the Individual Performance Map. And this is this happens to be the map of an instructional design manager. And so you see the name of that role in the middle. You see the people to who they deliver work outputs or accomplishments around the side there. And we call them customers, internal or external. And you see in the left there a list of some business results. And I'm not going to take time to do the exercise right now, but I think every single one of the outputs on that could be credibly listed to, and I see there's a request to speak, but let's wait a few minutes and then you can do so if that's okay. You could go to each one of these outputs and say, for example, best practice notes. Well, depending on how they're used, if they're used by your peers, that could definitely contribute to operational efficiency. It could possibly even, depending on what the notes are about, contribute to employee engagement. So you can speculate at a minimum, in some cases really nail down how these outputs contribute to those kinds of results. And this applies in the coaching program too. For example, our coaching program called the Performance Thinking Coach, we teach coaches to sit down with their direct reports or the people they're coaching, do one of these individual performance maps, which you can probably do in an hour plus or minus in most cases. And that clarifies expectations between the coach and the person being coached. And then they use the performance improvement logic, that way of thinking, to say, okay, how does this contribute to the organization? What behavior should we talk about here to produce it? What behavior influences are in place? How can we improve it and so forth? But we can anchor those outputs to business results. And if we expand out, there's a recent article. I actually don't have a link here. Anybody wants it, you can email me. But there's an article that was published in TD Magazine with me as author a few months ago on accomplishment-based talent development. Because what we've recognized is that at every single step, from recruitment and hiring to onboarding to training people for job readiness, and then for ongoing coaching and development, and for decisions about compensation and promotion, you can anchor all of that in accomplishments. And if you do that, and those accomplishments are sort of clearly contribute to different business results, you can basically have a thing which is a continuous improvement for organizational business results process that is in the hands of your coaches and the people they coach. So that's pretty much what I have to say, and we can talk in a couple minutes, but just sort of the shameless commerce part of this thing is, and by the way, some people have said, you don't have to say that. Probably I'm so old that nobody else remembers the Click and Clack, the Tappet brothers, but they had a radio show for years, these two guys who were auto mechanics from MIT, but they had a program called Car Talk, and they used to jokingly talk about shameless commerce. So maybe I shouldn't use that phrase anymore. But what I mean is, this is first of all, if this webinar, along with the 47 previous ones and a lot of other stuff, are on our YouTube channel, and the easy place to get there is performancethinking.tv. We'll get you there. And if you're watching the recording of this on YouTube, please like this and share it. It would be really nice, and also make comments. And then this literally is kind of the shameless commerce part, which is that our open practitioner program, we take our performance consulting certification program, which is called the Performance Thinking Practitioner Program, into companies who want to certify whole teams, companies like FedEx, for example, or Amgen and so forth. But we certify people to deliver that program inside of big companies. But we also have open programs about 3 or 4 times a year that individuals can sign up for, and a few of you have been in that. And so our next one starts in a few weeks, in March 3rd. There's still some seats open for it. And you can learn more about it with that QR code. And then we're sort of rebuilding our performance thinking coach program to be completely virtual. And we don't have a date for pilots yet, but either companies who might be interested in piloting this accomplishment-based program can reach out, or if you're interested, specifically, and you want to book a conversation with me, you can get to my calendar through that code. So I see that Ian wants to talk, so I'm going to bring that up. And I think you can speak. I don't know how it works at your end, Ian, but hopefully I just clicked on your name, and hopefully, except I don't see, I don't see Ian's listed here now. So maybe Ian left us. Not Ian Patterson, but well, would anyone like to make a comment or ask a question? And you can use the chat box too, of course, but I've set it up now so that I believe, let me just take a look. I believe that we can, you can speak if you ask to speak. I should get a little request that says you want to speak, and I'll click on you. But if not, let's see what we hear. Kate, okay. So I'm looking at the chat box. Marty talks about you can use exemplars to make the point. Yes, that's true. Marty's also says accomplishments and outcomes often are lagging and also often influenced by factors outside the employee's control. Well, accomplishments, the kind of level of accomplishments that we talk about are usually not lagging, to be honest. They're usually pretty immediate. That's a difference between this approach, but fair enough. Well, does anybody have any comments or questions that you want to add to this? Because I was hoping this might make you think of some stuff that was of interest. Anyone? Because we can certainly we can certainly end this early. I'm just looking at different colleagues here. Here's the chat thing. Rita, do I have any information about the relation but providing the performance thinking coaching to companies and their change in their business results? I don't. What I do know, though, is that, for example, one of our longtime colleagues, Shane Isley, introduced the coaching program into his ABA company originally years ago as a framework for clinical supervision. And so, in the clinical supervision environment, you have, let's say, behavior technicians who have to produce certain outputs, good working relationships with parents, materials ready to go, instructional decisions, session notes, et cetera, et cetera. And you can focus your coaching and supervision on those outputs, which typically works a little bit better than working on just behavior. So I don't have any specific information about that, Rita, but it's some companies have adopted this and found that at least it moves their people forward in terms of developing their capabilities. Patty says she has to jump to another meeting, but thank you, Patty. Anyone else? Because if not, I'll just sign off and we'll have a few extra minutes to grab lunch or something like that. Thank you, everybody, for participating. I hope this was useful. And it will be recorded. Well, has been recorded. It will be on our YouTube channel, certainly by the weekend, maybe a little bit before. So thank you, everybody. I think I'm going to end it then.